All right, here is your conclusion to George Washington Carver. There was a good school called Simpson College in nearby Indianola. George had been upset by the incident in Highland College and didn't want to go through that again. The Milhollands assured George that Simpson had no rule against blacks attending. They would even help him with the application. So George applied and was accepted and saved up his money for a year. He enrolled at Simpson in the fall of 1890. George was only the second black student in the history of Simpson College, which had opened its doors 30 years earlier in 1860. He studied music and art, and he ran a laundry business to help pay tuition. But after he paid for his classes, he had almost nothing left over. For quite 1 month, I lived on prayer, beef suet, that's chunks of beef fat, and cornmeal, he said, and quite often without the suet and meal. George was popular at Simpson with both his fellow students and his teachers. When they saw he was struggling to make ends meet, they snuck furniture, food, or other items into his room. They all seemed to take pride in seeing if he or she might not do more for me than someone else, George said. In art class, sometimes George painted plants. Other times, he brought in his plants to show the teacher, Miss Budd. She was impressed with how much he knew about horticulture, the science of fruits, vegetables, and flowering plants. She suggested that he consider attending Iowa State Agricultural School in Iowa. One reason was that her father taught science there. Another was that even though George was a very talented artist, she figured it would be difficult for anyone, especially a black man in the 1890s, to earn a living at it. George knew Miss Budd was right. He also knew that even though his art might help bring people enjoyment, his knowledge of agriculture might help bring food to their dinner tables. So after only 1 semester at Simpson College, George enrolled at Iowa State. In 1891, he studied chemistry, geology, botany, and zoology. In 1894, he became the first black person to graduate from Iowa State. When the school hired him as an assistant in botany, the science of plant life, George became the first black person to join the faculty there. George had no plans to leave Iowa State. He liked the faculty and the students there, and they liked him. He was studying for a graduate degree in agriculture and was teaching young men and women too. It looked as if George was set for a long career at the school. But in April 1896, he received a letter that changed his life. It was from educator and orator Booker T. Washington. Washington was perhaps the most famous black man in America in the late 1800s. In 1895, he gave a speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. The speech has come to be called the Atlanta Compromise. Washington essentially urged blacks to accept the idea of separate but equal in exchange for education, job training, and fairness in the court system. He wanted blacks to work with whites, not against them, to fight racism. Not everyone agreed with Booker T. Washington. Some of his critics in the civil rights movement felt that accepting separate but equal meant whites would always think that blacks were not as good as they were. Booker T. Washington, of course, did not believe that. But he believed that if blacks were ever to achieve true equality in the United States, they would need better education. That was why Booker jumped at the chance to start an all-black school in Tuskegee, Alabama. In 1881, the Tuskegee Institute opened in a rundown, one-room building that year with just $2,000 from the state of Alabama. The next year, the school purchased 100 acres of land, and the campus began to develop. Tuskegee wasn't a traditional college like Iowa State that accepted only high school graduates. Instead, some Tuskegee students had as little as a 5th grade education. Many of their parents and grandparents had been slaves. They were there for hands-on learning they could use in their day-to-day lives. As part of their classes, some early Tuskegee students actually built the classrooms that rose on the new campus. Booker was still the president of the Tuskegee Institute when he wrote to George in 1896. The school was growing, Booker explained. He wanted to add a Department of Agriculture, and he wanted George to be in charge of it. George had read about Booker's big Atlanta speech in the newspapers. George's belief about race relations were much the same as Booker's. George had lived among and worked with whites all his life. He believed that working with whites was the best path to equality. And of course, George recognized the value of an education. So that was why George, even though he was perfectly happy at Iowa State, thought long and hard about Booker's offer. Tuskegee couldn't pay George as much money and didn't have the modern buildings or equipment. He would be leaving the comfort and security of one job for the uncertainty of another. But the one great ideal of my life is to be of the greatest good to the greatest number of people, George wrote to Booker. So he accepted the job, finished up his graduate degree at Iowa State, and arrived at Tuskegee in October 1896. The city of Tuskegee and the surrounding area turned out to be an amazing place. George found many new plants and flowers to study. The school itself, however, wasn't so amazing. When George arrived, he had no rooms in which to store his collections and not even a laboratory in which to work. But George didn't worry about what he didn't have. Use what you find around you, he told his first students. He took them to a junkyard. They dug up old pots and pans, saucers and spoons, boxes and string, whatever they could find, and made their own laboratory. It was all part of hands-on learning for George's students. Didn't want to just stand in front of a classroom and give lectures. He wanted students to touch and feel nature and to think. On early morning walks, George collected samples of soil or flowers or insects that he shared in the classroom. Outside the classroom, he set up a practice farm on 10 acres of land. It was an experiment station. 1 acre was for testing the soil. Another was for growing sweet potatoes. Ugh, don't like those. Another for studying fertilizers, and so on. With the experiment station, George took his wish to be the greatest good to the greatest number seriously. He invited local farmers to come to the school once a month to learn about the soil. During their monthly meetings, George analyzed the farmer's soil and gave them samples of his. Then he started encouraging them to come in between the monthly meetings whenever they needed some help. Then he invited the wives to come along too. He showed them ways to plan meals and prepare food, and he discussed the value of different foods. George did not have the money for fancy equipment at Tuskegee, so his advice was helpful to the farmers who didn't have the money for fancy equipment either. George wanted farmers to pay attention to nature and all it had to offer. He wrote different booklets that taught how to grow tomatoes or raise hogs or preserve meat. The more farmers could do on their own, the less they had to spend at the market, and the less they had to go without. Anything that fills the dinner pail is valuable, he said. He wrote other booklets that helped farmers improve the appearance of their land and their homes. He knew they could not afford to buy paint, but he also knew there were plenty of natural resources. Different types of natural clay, for instance, could be mixed to make different colors for paint. With a little glue mixed in, it would stick to cabin walls. George also taught farmers how to care for native plants, flowers, and grasses, and how to fix up their homes. Such a work schedule, though, was exhausting. George liked to get up by 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock, and walk in the woods. Then he taught 4 or 5 classes each day. He also ran the experiment station and worked in the homemade laboratory. He continued to paint and draw, too, and he often wrote letters to Moses and Susan Carver and to the other families he had lived with. He organized a Bible study class once a week. His intense workload and many interests left George little time for fun. Sometimes his friends set him up on dates, but he never married. In 1906, George designed the Jessup Agricultural Wagon. It was a movable classroom and portable laboratory. The Jessup wagon was named for a New York banker, Morris K. Jessup, who helped pay for it. A former student of George's was in charge of taking the wagon to faraway farmers who couldn't make it to Tuskegee. The wagon was loaded with soil, seeds, booklets, and other materials. In 1908, George had the chance to visit Moses, who had moved to Kansas after Susan's death several years earlier. It would be the last time George saw his foster father. Moses Carver died in his late 90s in 1910. 5 years after losing his father, George also lost his friend, Booker T. Washington. Booker was only 59 when he died of heart failure in 1915. George and Booker didn't always agree on how things should be run at Tuskegee, but they were close friends. I am sure Mr. Washington never knew how much I loved him and the cause for which he gave his life, George wrote another friend. Booker T. Washington had been the face of the Tuskegee Institute since the school opened its doors. After his death, Robert Russa Moton became president of Tuskegee. I don't know how to say that name, Robert Russa Moton. But it was George who became the most famous person at the school. While at Tuskegee, George liked to tell a story about a talk he once had with God. "Mr. Creator, why did you make the universe?" George asked. "Little man, that question is too big for you," God answered. "Try another." So George asked, "Mr. Creator, why did you make man?" God answered, "Little man, that question is still too big for you. Try another." This time George asked, "Mr. Creator, why did you make the peanut?" And God said, "Little man, that question is just your size. You listen and I will teach you." Apparently, George was a good listener because while experimenting at Tuskegee, he began to develop more than 300 products that could be made from peanut. They included everything from peanut milk to peanut punch, plastics, glues, soaps, and dyes. Peanuts were considered so lowly that before George began to study them, they were mostly used for animal food. Farmers couldn't make much money from peanuts and had little reason to grow them. I love peanuts. Cotton had been the main crop in the American South, but in the 1900s, it cost some farmers more to grow cotton than they could sell it for. The boll weevil, the nasty boll weevil, a type of beetle that feeds on cotton buds and can destroy entire crops, came to the United States from Mexico in the late 1800s. By 1910, it arrived in Alabama. After many years of studying soil, George knew that planting cotton over and over again sucked the nutrients, substances plants need to grow out of the soil. He wanted farmers to rotate their crops. That meant growing cotton one season, but switching to a different crop the next. Then they could replant cotton the season after that. One of the crops George recommended for cotton growers was the sweet potato. Sweet potato plants were easy to grow, and crops could be stored during the winter months. They were good for the soil, and they could be eaten many different ways. Some of George's earliest bulletins were on the sweet potato. George also experimented with cowpeas, sugar beets, rice, soybeans, alfalfa, and more. His experiments helped him understand the best way to grow these crops so that they would yield the most food. He learned what kinds of soil and growing conditions they needed. In 1910, Tuskegee built George a modern laboratory to replace his homemade one. And by 1915, his experiments were taking so much of his time that he began to give up teaching. In 1916, George wrote his most famous booklet, How to Grow the Peanut, and 105 ways of preparing it for human consumption. Recipes included items such as peanut soup, peanut bread, and peanut pudding. Several recipes including peanut butter in them. Peanut butter was number 51. Peanut butter candy was number 70. And peanut butter fudge was number 80. In fact, George wrote so much about peanuts that he is sometimes mistakenly credited with inventing peanut butter. That same year, George produced his famous peanut booklet. He was honored by the Royal Society of Arts in London. The Royal Society honors people in science and art who find practical solutions to problems. That summed up George perfectly. At the time, it was rare for an American to be honored, let alone one who had been born into slavery. Around this same time, George was repeatedly offered a job to work for American inventor Thomas Edison in his New Jersey laboratory. George could have become rich working for Edison, but he was devoted to helping the farmers in the South, so he stayed at Tuskegee. The Peanut Journal wrote that George Washington Carver is to the peanut industry what Thomas Edison is to electricity. One biographer even called George the patron saint of the peanut industry. George was never interested in personal glory, but his work with peanuts made him famous. In 1921, he took a train to Washington, D.C. to talk to Congress about the peanut industry. George was supposed to give a 10-minute talk, but when his 10 minutes were up, the politicians gave him another 10 minutes. And then those 10 minutes were up, they told him, talk as long as you need. George pulled samples out of a box to show different ways peanuts could be used in milk, breakfast foods, oils, and more. Texas Congressman John N. Garner, who later became Vice President of the United States, called it a most wonderful exhibition. Congress passed a law that helped the peanut industry. After that, George wrote newspaper and magazine articles about the peanut industry, and he advised companies that produced peanuts. He also continued working at Tuskegee. He no longer taught classes, but focused on his work in the laboratory instead. He came to be known as a creative chemist, a scientist who remakes a product, such as peanuts in George's case, for different uses. He received awards from organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which we read about when we read about Rosa Parks' book. This is before Rosa Parks. He also began working with the United States Department of Agriculture to help identify and prevent plant diseases in the South. Though he discovered hundreds of non-food uses for the peanut and many for the sweet potato too, none of George's products were sold to the public. George's goal was never to get rich, though. He rarely spent the money he did make, unless it was to help a former student who needed a loan. He was known for wearing the same old clothes day after day. Even after he began receiving awards and honors for his work, George wanted to find ways to help people. He still taught his weekly Bible study class, and he always was willing to help any student in need. He was like a second father to many of the men and offered sound words of advice. In 1937, to celebrate George's 40 years at Tuskegee Institute, the school unveiled a bronze bust of him on campus. A press release and notices in the Peanut Journal asked for a $1 donation to pay for the artwork. People, both black and white, who admired George sent in their donations from all over the country. 2 years later, the George Washington Carver Museum opened in Tuskegee. It included parts of George's original homemade laboratory, samples of the peanut products he created, educational exhibits, and much more. Dozens of George's paintings hung on the walls. In 1940, George donated his entire life savings, about $60,000, to start the George Washington Carver Foundation at the Tuskegee Institute for Agricultural Research. He wanted others to continue his work at Tuskegee even after he was gone. In his later years, George's health began to fail him, but he didn't stop working. In December 1942, he hurt himself when he fell down some stairs at the museum. He never fully recovered, and he died in January 1943. It is believed he was 78 years old. He was buried next to his friend Booker T. Washington on the Tuskegee campus. 5 years after George's death, he became only the second black American to be depicted on a postage stamp. Booker T. Washington had been the first. In 1953, in Diamond Grove, Missouri, he became the first black American to have a national monument dedicated to him. Hundreds of schools across the United States are now named for this great scientist. Critics say that most of George's work did not produce amazing breakthroughs or discoveries. Instead, he found practical ways for science to make people's lives better. In many ways, George was ahead of his time. He understood the importance of nutrition and a balanced diet long before many others did. He saw value in caring for the environment and growing fruits and vegetables naturally. He recycled items that had been discarded and found new uses for them. George helped the economy in the American South. He helped farmers move away from their dependency on growing cotton, and he helped poor farmers find ways to take care of themselves. He did all that while never losing his passion for nature that he first showed in his youth. As George's tombstone at Tuskegee reads, he could have added fortune to fame, but caring for neither, he found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world. Gosh, what a great guy. That's the end. Thank you very much for listening.